Let us be blunt, folks. Video games will not make a normal person become a violent psychotic. This form of entertainment and art will not make those who enjoy it and play it become a monster. This is a debate we've had since about the 70s. A debate that's gone on so long that in the early 90s it had to have its own rating system, much like the films did decades prior. A debate that should have ended in 2012 when the Supreme Court of the United States said it's an art and therefore must be protected by the First Amendment as such. However, once we are allowed to be closer than 6 feet to each other, something will happen, and the powers to be will blame video games for crimes and other tragedies like they did nearly every time one of these violent tragedies became newsworthy. Despite all that, there is no substantial evidence that video games cause the safeguards in a healthy human mind to switch off any more than a pep rally, a debate, a sporting event, or any other form of entertainment we have. Even then, when something like a parent gets into a fistfight with an umpire or tackles a kid on the opposing team of their own child, we blame the adult, we blame the grown-up, not the sport, not the activity. For as much flack that 50 Shades of Grey and crime dramas like Law and Order get, and a lot of times deservedly so, for supposedly encouraging their content on the real world, those are usually problems for someone that already follows that mindset, or is but one of many symptoms of the powers of be in the media at large, bombarding you and me with a message till they tear down our walls and our defenses. Mr. Gray, for instance, may be an abusive jerk in his own book series, but he's tragically as much a standard for the romance genre as a cowboy hat is a must-have item for the Western. Unfortunately, video games are still part of the same medium machine, therefore produce the same issues as other forms of entertainment we have, and it would be morally bankrupt not to acknowledge that. However, we seem to let other media slide and pick on the video games more times than not because of its more interactive component. Much in the same way, ironically enough, the supposed realism gave movies flack back in the 1920s. Now, many of you watching this have probably already come to this conclusion and have already found a small little issue with this kind of an idea about video games inciting real-world violence. And it's simple. We all know normal, healthy people who grow up with violent media, including video games, and still grow up to be decent people in the end. And it's like we've had hundreds of years of this. The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Dark Crystal, King Arthur, Robin Hood, The Princess Bride, James Bond, Davy Crockett, The Three Musketeers, The Last of the Mohicans, Zulu, Star Trek, Indiana Jones, Superman, and the list can go on and on for infinitum. To use myself as an example, I was born in 1986, so most of my childhood was in the 90s. That meant I had a large collection of media being produced that I watched. Now, besides the stuff that was being produced in that decade, there was still a lot of things being rebroadcasted from the previous decades that stood the test of time. Now, despite all of that media swirling around my young developing mind, I never grew up to be the kind of person that ends up on the FBI's most wanted list. The same can be said about video games for myself and others when it comes to enriching and improving our lives. Games in franchises such as the Mario Brothers, The Legend of Zelda, the Castlevania Adventure, Armored Core, Final Fantasy, Devil May Cry, Halo, Street Fighter, Contra, Metal Gear Solid, and so on and so on. Despite this, video games and their content will still be a punching bag of sorts for the powers to be. This is because for a generation of news personalities and lawmakers, They don't quite understand it. They don't get the medium. On the other hand, an ideology that may have encouraged their views may have been propagated just as much by the video game industry as much as their own ignorance. Most video games marketed in the United States use violence to get from point A to point B. It doesn't matter if it's a AAA game that's got millions of dollars and high-end backers behind it, or something more independent that's mostly run on hopes, dreams, and a couple crates of top ramen. The few games that don't rely heavily on violence and to progress are unfortunately going to be part of a niche. And if it's not a sports game, that niche gets even smaller. It would be like if the literary world said you can only sell romance novels, or if the movie studios said you can only show comedies. A ton of great things have come from either genre, but that'd be incredibly limiting. Now, how things are handled in the video game industry and how their choices of games are limiting the overall potential of gaming is a discussion for another day, and one that has been brought up by people that are much smarter than I over and over again. Now, a good chunk of the violence in video games can be explained by the choice of demographics. Dudes. In the United States, most video games are aimed at boys and men. Now, there have always been girls that have been into video games. There have always been adult women who have been fascinated with them. And there have always been girls and women who have proven how awesome they are by not only beating their male counterparts, but doing so day in and day out and getting paid to do so. It's just convention norm that stuff aimed at the guys tends to get more action-oriented material, and a cheap, easy way to get that is with violence. Thankfully, the more brutal aspects of this violence tends to be marketed towards the adults and the teenagers, and little kids theoretically don't have to be exposed to this. But even when making a game towards the younger audience, violence is generally going to be a main tool from getting from point A to point B. Granted, you could say the same thing with a lot of stuff marketed at little boys for as long as there have been little boys. From the toys to the books, from the movies to the TV shows. And let's be honest, the same will definitely be said about the grown-up men a lot of these boys are going to turn into. Now, is there a problem when the video games are the prevailing pastime, or the, worse yet, the babysitter for a child? Oh, heavens, yes. But that's a problem simply because children are sponges. They absorb the world around them into their being, and that makes their character for later in life, their sense of right and wrong. And when left to their own devices or left to the media to teach them such things, things can be problematic if an adult isn't there to guide them. Unfortunately, we have known plenty of so-called adults and grown-ups that have done things to warrant an episode of Jerry Springer, or Cops, or America's Dumbest, or get up their own page on Not Always Right. And while this can leave us wondering how these said children can still remain safe and sane, it only gets worse when the adults that these children use as their exemplars to what a normal, healthy adult should be decide to get into a temper tantrum at a public place, or decide to prove a point by destroying their kids' stuff when, say, locking it up where they can't get to it or donating it would be just as effective, if not more so. Come on, what's going to tell a child that violence is indeed the answer to all their problems in life more? What I just described as their exemplars? Or the video games. Even when we get to the part of the discussion where we have to talk about those whose state of mind is different from what is considered normal, I have problems taking the video games cause real world violence seriously. Oh, sure, 24-hour news will attach themselves like a lamprey on the fact that a killer has a mental ailment or a developmental disability as much as they will the fact that they had a gaming system at their house. They usually miss the point entirely. It is no secret that most people with mental conditions, such as my spectrum of autism, are more likely to become victims of abuse. Abuse by the hands of those that are considered normal. And while it is always true that a victim can become a victimizer, the bullied into the bully, more times than not, we are harmless. But we have everything to fear from you normal folk, and you have very little to fear from us. But regardless of the reasons, the kind of murders and killings that usually get blamed on by video games in the past, there's no excuse for this. There's never been a good excuse for it. This is especially true of a lot of the spree killings that happen at way too many schools in the United States. So much so that most of them don't even make it on the news anymore, they're so common. To use myself as an example, I and several of my friends participated in Special Olympics. That means the organization, the coaches, were very generous in what they were willing to put up with when it came to our maturity levels, our hang-ups, our quirks, our coping mechanisms. They also had high expectations of us, chiefly being be a decent human being. That is, of course, the basis of all good sportsmanship. The coaches also took our safety very seriously. If any one of us was going to be a danger to the rest of us, they got banned. They were not permitted to participate in anything Special Olympics did. We were still hyper competitive with each other and the other teams, and we still went home to a shelf's worth of violent video games, but we still held on to that high standard set out for us. I sadly cannot say the same for a lot of what passes for normal. There are always going to be those whose views of the world and how they handle their problems are skewed. There is little, if any, excuse for their actions. Victims of all manner of abuses have risen up to be great leaders and changers of the world. And the world has become a better place because of this. The same fearless mentality that makes one person a danger to society could also make another want to put their life at risk to save others. Even with those with a high sociopathic or narcissistic personality can use their lack of empathy of others in ways that help those around them. And in the case of school disasters, despite the myth that the perpetrator is usually a victim of bullying, more times than not, they're not poor old Rudolph. They are the other ranger. They already had a disregard for their fellow human beings that was sickening at the best of times. Finally, there's the fact that any given video game sells millions of copies around the world. That means there's going to be millions of people that enjoy that. And when you get a group of people of any sort in large numbers, there's always going to be a few terrible human beings in that group. Again, blame the individual for their actions, not their pastime. It's the safe and sane thing to do.